Hello and welcome. Before the war and immediately after the war, London Transport's single-deck fleet, which is often overshadowed by the larger double-decker fleet, was a little bit of a mixed bag, and certainly couldn't be described as highly standardised. Directly after the war, there were still buses like the side-engined AEC in service, and buses of a more conventional layout such as the AEC Regal IV, which were better known as the T-Class.
Now, compared with these front-engine designs, the Q-Class buses were a very advanced design for their time, and we'll definitely be looking at these in a future video in this series.
Now, London Transport did possess underfloor engine single-decker buses, and this was the TF class, which was introduced by Leyland in 1937, the first one being delivered to Chiswick in July of that year. And I suppose you could say that the TF class was a direct link from the AEC-Q to the RF bus itself.
The TFs had been built for the Green Line services and the private hire fleet. However, with the intervention of war, a lot of them had been laid up and they had a rather short life. For an underfloor engine vehicle, they had a very conventional layout though, with a separate driver's cab and an entrance behind the front axle.
But London Transport was very impressed with them and had deemed them as a success. Now, although people will argue that putting the engine at the front is more reliable, when it comes to the economics of running a bus service, the engine space does take a certain amount of room away from the saloon of the bus. And the saloon is where the money is made because that's where the fare-paying passengers sit. By putting the engine under the floor, you allowed the passengers to sit on top of it and thus create more room inside and more bums on seats.
In 1946, the Birmingham Midland Motor Omnibus Company launched an underfloor engine bus of their own. However, this had the front axle set back and the entrance and exit door ahead of the front axle and level with the driver, and this was regarded as a very advanced layout for its time. Now, although London Transport had underfloor engine buses, they didn't have any to this layout, and London Transport did like to be at the forefront of the cutting edge technology.
Coupled to the fact that London Transport was looking to standardise its single-decker fleet in the same way that it was standardising its double-decker fleet on the time on the RT type Regent 3s. And again, these Regent 3s, the RT class, will be the feature of a future video in this series. In 1949, AEC developed an underfloor engined AEC Regal Mark IV, and the prototype vehicle was registered UMP 227. That's a fantastic registration, isn't it? Hopefully the maintenance staff at the garages it worked at, which was St Albans and Reigate, UMP 227 was trialled at these garages during May 1950 onwards.
And hopefully the maintenance staff didn't get the with the new layout, because UMP 227 featured a setback axle and the entrance ahead of this axle like the Birmingham Motor Midland Omnibus design.
And these trials were certainly successful because it resulted in London Transport ordering 700 of these new single-decker vehicles, and this comprised of 25 private hire coaches, which was RF 1 to 25, 263 Green Line coaches, which was RF 26 to 288, and 225 central area buses, which was RF 289 to 513, as well as 187 country area buses, which was RF 514 to 700. Now, over the years, the changes to the actual allocation of these vehicles changed as vehicles were moved around due to the differing passenger trends of the time. But overall, that fleet total would remain the same until 1963-64, when a limited number were withdrawn from service. The new bus would be called the RF. Now, I've come across several theories on how they were called the RF class. One is R for Regal and F for 4, Regal 4, whilst the other is Regal front entrance, as the buses had a very modern looking front entrance ahead of the front axle. I'd be interested to hear your theories, and if you know the reason why the RF class was the RF class, if it was for the reasons I've just specified or if it was something else, please comment down below. All of the RFs would be bodied by Metropolitan Camel Carriage and Wagon Company of Birmingham and would be powered by an AEC 9.6 litre diesel engine, which was mounted horizontally under the floor as I mentioned earlier on. Now, interestingly, the time that London Transport placed the order for the RF, the maximum permitted length for a two-axle vehicle was 27 foot 6 inches long. However, the Ministry of Transport would shortly approve an increase to 30 foot. But this would be after the first buses had been delivered, and London Transport would have to accept that some of the buses would be to the 27 foot 6 inch length. With this in mind, London Transport decided that the batch of private hire vehicles would be the first ones built, and it was originally envisaged that the country area vehicles that followed the private hire vehicles would also be to this length as well. By the time these shorter buses had been built, it was hoped that the regulation had changed, allowing the central area and the Green Line batches to be of the new 30-foot length, which is quite interesting when you think in latter years, and I say latter years as in the 1970s, the buses that replaced the RFs, the Swifts and the Merlins, were often criticised for being too long for the streets of London, or at least central London. Now, another reason that the private hire vehicles would be the first ones to be built was they were needed for work regarding the Festival of Britain, which was held in May 1951. However, only 5 coaches were ready by the 4th of May, which was the day the festival commenced. Ordered concurrently at the same time as these first RFs were a batch of high specification touring coaches, also on AEC Regal IV chassis. These would become the RFWs, the W standing for wide, as these vehicles were 8-foot wide bodies on a slightly modified chassis, and these were bodied by Eastern Coachworks. In the meantime, the maximum length increase to 30 foot had been approved, which meant that it would only be the private hire vehicles that was built to the 27 foot 6 inch length. And as a result of this, the London Transport order was slightly tweaked so that the buses that followed the private hire vehicles were the Green Line and the central area buses. So the buses to be delivered directly after the private hire vehicles were Green Line coaches. However, things don't always go to plan, and there were delays in the deliveries of the first examples, with RF26 not arriving until mid-September. 2 weeks later, on the 1st of October, RF26 was licensed at Tunbridge Wells and started working on Route 704, which was Tunbridge Wells to Windsor. The first red central buses were delivered from the 1st of September 1952, so that's getting on for a year after those Green Line ones arrived. And these red RFs entered service comparatively quickly, and did so at Muswell Hill on Route 210, which ran from Golders Green to Finsbury Park, and that was on the 11th of September 1952. The complete batch of 225 central area buses had all been delivered by the March of 1953. And after these red buses came the final batch, which was for the country area, and this was the 187 buses for the Green London Transport operation. And again, these buses entered service comparatively quickly at Reigate Garage. There had been routes in the country area of London Transport that had been one-man operated for many years. However, at the time, the law restricted the use of one-man operated buses to vehicles with a maximum of 26 seats. And in those days, it really was one-man operation. There were very, very few lady drivers around, and equality wasn't really the thing it is now. London Transport decided to conduct an experiment with 3 of the RFs to see the practicalities of one-man operated buses at the size of an RF. Now at 41 seats, the RF wasn't legal to use as a one-man operated bus at that time. However, a little bit like the length restrictions when the RFs were being built, that legislation was changing, and the three RFs, which was RF 517, RF 647 and RF 700, were modified prior to entry into service to allow them to operate with just the driver, one-man operation. This began in March 1954 on Route 419, which was Epsom to Bettsgrave Langley Vale, and it was operated by Leatherhead Garage. In August, the experiment was transferred to Hemel Hempstead's Route 316, which ran from Hemel Hempstead to Chesham Broadway. As with the 419 service, there was deemed to be no problem with the operation of the buses in a one-man operated format, and the experiments were deemed to be a success. And it's interesting that these experiments that London Transport performed basically sowed the seeds for something that we now take for granted, one-person operated buses. In 1966, it became legal to operate double-decker buses as one-man operated. And all this really does stem, to some extent, from this experiment that London Transport started at Leatherhead Garage and then at Hemel Hempstead. By the time of the 1960s, the entire country bus area, RFs, had been made suitable for one-man operation, and it had been hoped that this would extend into the central area operating territory too. But there was a lot of opposition from the trade unions, which certainly wasn't helped as well by the crippling staff shortages that London Transport was being affected by. And this bubbled over in October 1963 with the imposition of rest day working and overtime ban. To cut a long story short, there was an agreement reached following government intervention, who set up a committee of inquiry. And basically this committee turned round and said that the London Transport bus drivers' earnings should be related to those of semi-skilled and skilled workers in the capital. Now, this is a long way away from 4 years ago when the BBC described bus driving as an unskilled job. And to be fair, this is something that completely gets my back up. We have to go through so many hours of training to get the licence in the first place. And once we've got the licence, we have to sit through so many days of training over a 5-year period. So really, not in a million years could you describe it as an unskilled job. And I think back in 1963, 1964, when this committee said that London bus drivers should be paid equivalent to semi-skilled and skilled London workers, there was much more respect for the work that bus drivers do. Anyway, Jake, stick with the programme. This recommendation by the committee to up the wages of the bus drivers in London opened the door for the introduction of one-man operation on the suburban and central buses. And this would see the London Bus Reshaping Programme, which would champion the use of high-capacity standee single-decker and double-decker buses, and would be all one-man operated. As I mentioned previously, by 1959, the entire batch of country bus RFs, 539 to 700, were all equipped for one-man operation. After these were converted, 37 central buses, RFs 502 to 538, were modified in the same way, and this was with the intention of converting routes 216, which was Kingston to Staines via Sunbury, and 218, Kingston to Staines via Walton, and 219, Kingston to Weybridge, to one-man operation in May 1959. But, as I mentioned again earlier, there was no operating agreement with the trade union, and negotiations didn't really get anywhere, so it would be another 5 years before these buses would be used as their intended one-man operation. These red one-man operated central area buses operating with conductors and conventional crew buses. Now, interestingly, the central area red RFs were delivered without doors because the Metropolitan Police felt that the opening and closing of doors would slow the whole operation of the bus down and make it dangerous for the traffic following behind. So one of the modifications in converting them and making them suitable for OPO use was to fit them with doors. By the mid-1960s, the Green Line RF coaches were approaching 14 years of continuous service and was starting to get a little bit tired. So London Transport decided to refurbish them. This was seen to be the more favoured decision as passenger levels were dropping on the routes and they probably couldn't justify the cost of new single-decker buses or newer single-decker buses to replace the RFs. The first one to be refurbished was RF 136, and this was commenced in July 1965, and it returned in the following March 1966. It featured the same red and grey seat maquette as the Routemaster coaches. It also featured fluorescent lighting, grey window cappings and a white ceiling. The driver's side two-piece windscreen was replaced by a curved single-piece example, and twin headlights were fitted. Although still painted in the traditional Lincoln green, this was trimmed with a pale green band, which was edged with chrome trim. The refurbishment was very well received, and the decision was taken to do a further 174 RFs to this standard, and in August 1966 this programme commenced. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole details of the operations of the RF because it would make it an hour-long video rather than a 15-20 minute long video. They were deployed, they were redeployed, they were moved around, and they worked on an awful lot of routes in the London and the London country area. And then, of course, there's the Green Line services they operated too. London Transport had envisaged getting rid of the RFs by 1972. Which still would have given them a long life compared with a lot of buses in later years. Most buses tend to have a 15-year lifespan. But as of 1972, the RFs would have been 20 years old. Now, we all know the stories of the AEC Swifts, the AEC Merlins and the Fleet Lines, the DMSs, which had entered London Transport service, but not been the success that they had envisaged. And this was to play a part in the long lifespan of the RF, coupled to the fact that there were a number of routes that the other buses physically couldn't operate due to width and length restrictions. At the time, London Transport couldn't really see any suitable vehicle of that size that it could replace the RF with. In March 1974, this came in the form of an order for 95 Bristol LH chassis, with 39-seat Eastern Coachworks bodies. In addition to this, LT was planning that 115 standee Swifts would be modified to be fully seated, and these, with the newly ordered LHs, would allow for the replacement of the remaining RFs. Now, these LHs would become the BL class, while the up-seated Swifts would become the SMDs. And to be fair, these Swift conversions weren't overly popular, and in the end none were actually ever used for an RF conversion. London Transport would also start taking Leyland Nationals too, which would help ease the situation slightly. And slowly but surely the RFs were taken out of service and their routes were operated by the newer vehicles, the BL Bristol LHs. There was one quirk though, the routes 218 and 219 at Kingston Garage, and it was discovered that Kingston Garage, the pits were too short to accommodate the longer vehicles. As a result of this, the RFs persevered at Kingston and stayed there in service until Saturday the 31st of March 1979. The solution for the 218 and the 219 route had been simple. London Transport transferred the operation of these routes to Norbiton Garage, and the last bastion of the RFs were replaced by Leyland Nationals. The following day, on Sunday the 1st of April, there was an early morning convoy as Kingston's serviceable RFs set off for secure storage at the former Clapton garage, with RF 495 subsequently being passed on to the London Transport Museum, along with RF 537, which was one of the final batch. Thus the curtain fell on the central area London Transport RF. But what about the country buses? Well, on the 1st of January 1970, the country area services of London Transport passed to the National Bus Company and became London Country Bus Services Limited. Now, I've done a video on London Country and the crisis that they had with their fleet in the 1970s, and I'll try and remember to put a link up in the top there for you. But on its formation, London Country inherited a lot of former London Transport vehicles. RMLs, RTs, to name a few, and of course RFs. In the early 1970s, there was quite a lot of service withdrawals and cutbacks to the timetables, coupled to the arrival of the first Leyland Nationals, allowed the withdrawal of quite a few of the RFs. London Country's first Bristol LHs arrived in October 1973. Now, I previously mentioned London Country's vehicle shortage, but this had a knock-on effect that the RFs that were replaced by these Bristol LHs and the Leyland Nationals tended to be moved on somewhere else to replace expired vehicles, rather than withdrawn and scrapped or sold. So although it looked like the RFs were being withdrawn and replaced at the time, they were just really being pushed from pillar to post to fill in gaps in the services and the allocations. Officially, the last London Country RF ran on the 29th of January 1977. But in reality, 22 RFs with certificates of fitnesses were kept throughout the company and were used to cover for vehicle shortages at the various garages around the network. The last two garages to operate the RFs was Dartford, who operated RF 221 up until September 1978, when it moved on to Chelsham Garage for a few months before withdrawal, and Northfleet, which operated RF 202, and this remained at Northfleet until withdrawal in July 1979, after it unfortunately suffered a gearbox failure. And as for the private hire RFs, well, these were the first in and the first out, unfortunately, and these were withdrawn between 1963 and 1964. Now, there were some very similar deck and a half BEA coaches built, but due to time constraints, I will feature these in a separate video at a later date. Now, we're very lucky to have many of the RF class buses in preservation. And indeed, there was a trend of them appearing on heritage services in the 80s, the 90s and the early 2000s, so it can be argued that the RFs have actually never gone away. And we've reached the end of the RF story. Now, please remember that this is just a potted history of a bus that had an incredibly long lifetime with London Transport and London Country. And if there's anything that I've missed out or not put in, it's probably because of time constraints and the fact that this video could easily be twice the length that it is now. So I apologise if I've left something out that's important to you. If I have, please comment down below and let me know all about it. I'd love to hear your comments, your memories and your recollections all about the RF. If you did enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up, like it and share it. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the little notification bell so you receive future notifications of when I make future releases in this, my London Transport series, and my other series here on YouTube, such as the A to Z of National Bus Company subsidiaries and my videos on classic bus histories. Thanks ever so much for watching. Bye for now.